Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, regardless of what time this lecture finds you. I hope it finds you well. This lecture will cover the module for week 2 agendas and outcomes, and we will discuss the readings. We will discuss some of the things that we need to know in advance before we start the assignment and put us on track to starting to develop our first assignment, which is a digital presentation. So this week we'll be leaping metaphorically into the lion's den of rhetoric and everyday texts. So there are really just there's two objectives for this week. One is understanding the language of rhetoric, and 2 is evaluating our communities of practice. We will do that through, an interesting assignment. But before we get there, let's talk about the reading. So in the Rhet Ops text, Chapter 7, Gamergate, Understanding the Tactics of Online Knowledge Disruptors, that will be the reading. And it's kind of dense. It's not super crazy dense. There's a couple different things I was looking at, and this one I thought worked really well for what we wanted to do. There is also, if you look in files, a Word document. I will make sure that I label it. Let me go there right now and look to see what I've labeled it as so that we're not having 2 different conversations. So I'm scrolling, it's Module 2 notes, it's here, and you will see that not only do I have the module, but I have the digital presentation in a Word document as well as in the assignment. So let's back up again, back to where we're supposed to be. So, dancing around a lot. You know what, let me just do it right from the file so that you guys can see that I'm on the same page as you when we're looking at it. So, lots of fun things to go over. Module 2 is right here. All right, so we look at Module 2 notes. It opens like this. Again, next week I'll try something a little different on the way I do the module notes. I'm not a real big fan of the Word document format like this, so I'm probably going to start using some of my pagination skills to do some stuff, but I do not like slides. So if you're trying to figure out where I'm going with some of this stuff, I'm going to be trying different things, and, well, that's part of the everyday text. In this context, a Word document is an everyday text that we would have contact with, so it kind of fits. So Module 2 is called, I've given it a little title, Into the Lion's Den, right? The subhead under it is texting more than just texting. So when we start to think about text, we're using a very broad and abstract term to describe through very specific language something that means to convey a message to an audience, in short, to be rhetorical. The first thing we will need to do is understand that text is not limited in definition as something like words, communications produced through ASCII SMS, or writing. Instead, I want you to think of text in a very broad and nuanced, abstract way of thinking. When we say something like a text, we could say something like what a person does semiotically, what they do through music. Semiotics we'll touch base on in a minute. What they do with lighting, what they do with their background. For example, I have my friend Vladimir here, the gnome behind me. He's always behind me. I really like him. I like gnomes, and so it becomes sort of textual. And when you see it in my images, right? When I'm doing videos, when I'm taking pictures and things like that. So when I think about text, and I want you to think that way, I want you to understand that when we talk about everyday text, we're talking about everything from the actual act of texting to those things that I just described, all the way down to something as mundane as filling out your tax forms, what that form might look like, or when you apply for a job, how they set up that application and what those things say. What is attempted to be persuaded by? We don't realize that that's going on, but it really is. So beyond the confines and boundaries of a dictionary definition is where we're kind of going with it, right? And if the definition of a text is to message or the message within a document, can we take that further? That's kind of the line of thinking I want you to pick up when you start thinking about how we're doing assignments and how we're even looking at the reading for this class. So other things that could be textual are songs, images, videos, books, but for our purposes, I think it would be best to assume that anything that was a modality of communication. Again, I say that because, and I'm looking around my desk for examples. For example, These are my cycling gloves. They're winter. They have 45 North on them as a label, right? And that is a modality of communication. Not only am I wearing something that communicates a business logo, so I'm kind of like a NASCAR, right? I'm riding down the road on my bicycle. People see my gloves who are riders, and they might say something like, oh, I wonder where he got his gloves, or what gloves is he wearing? Well, I'm wearing 45 North. And even that becomes textually different in that if you understand that the 45th North parallel happens to cross through Minnesota, which is where this company is at. Another one would be something like my AirPods. They do something, they say something, they convey a message. Yes, for me, they were a gift, and they were something that I really value because I like to listen to music when I walk, when I ride my bike. But they also tell people something from the outside. Think about what is conveyed, what is communicated if you see somebody walking around with cheap headphones or big, bulky headphones, or in this case, AirPods. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. And I think that's probably the easiest way to think about text, is not just what is written, but what is conveyed, what is inferred through physical artifacts, through textual artifacts, if you will. So it gets kind of deep, but stay with me and you should be okay. So semiotics, or symbol systems, is a form of rhetoric. It's a subfield of rhetoric that explores the symbol systems that we use. And this means that from the simplest of text, something like a stop sign, the shape, the color, you don't even need text on it, that we understand the message, the text that is being conveyed without even reading the word alto or stop or halt. So it indicates something, but it is a text as well, just in what it does rhetorically. So another example of symbols. Another one that pops in mind that I have written here is if you see someone with an Apple phone versus an Android phone, you make connections to the person and infer identity and agency on them. And in this case, identity is fluid, right? Identity is fluid in that a person could have an Apple but have no income. For example, my children have Apple devices, but they have no income. But if they walk the streets to go for a walk to the store and someone sees an Apple phone, it does convey something to them. It does create an identity, and oddly, in that identity, there is some power dynamic built into it. So I want you to think through, like, that's how text starts to work. And then we have language or lexicon, right? So even the use of language, my children use these words drip, riz, sus, sigma, Chad, Karen, Kevin, Gucci, or cap. These are not even words that we use in our everyday language, especially not here in Elko, but they're interacted with, and we are interacted with, and through our social media. And so even the language invokes identities and power and sets up power dynamics. And that's important to think about when we think about everyday text. And all these things fall under the control of a message, text, which has a rhetorical purpose of ascribing or inscribing identity. And I say ascribing means because someone else can put that on them, or it can be simply inscribed. It's in the logos. It's in all the things that we do. It's visible, and it's done intentional. Now, I want to look at something like rhetoric. So rhetoric has a lot of definitions. So these are the two parts of what we're dealing with, right? We're dealing with text, and we're dealing with rhetoric. Has a lot of definitions, especially if you consider all the various historical and cultural contexts. If you take a moment to look at all the different avenues that the word comes to being, sometimes we'd call entanglement for our purposes, because rhetoric works in different ways, and how it interacts with text and us and an experience and the community that we're involved in, well, it gets really confusing really quickly. So historically, I would say show you something like Aristotle and explain rhetoric and the art of rhetoric, or even the root of the word, which is a medieval word. I think it's Middle French is when we start to get to the word rhetor, which is the noun for the person who is trying to persuade. And persuasion is a big part of the word. It is really a big part of what we are talking about in our class. But I would like to turn that back to you. And so for our first assignment, we're going to do one of two things. We're going to do the reading, and we're also going to do a digital presentation. So for the digital presentation, we probably want to look at that before we get back to the notes. So let me close this really fast, go back, and back, and back, and back one more time. There we are. And so now we're at the digital presentation, which connects to the rhetoric conversation that we were just having. So for this assignment, you will create a digital presentation using at least one image, one audio, and one text. Audio, i.e., you can do something narrative, you can use music, you can do a whole lot of things, and it's open to your interpretation to explain your understanding of the word rhetoric. And the overall presentation will be saved as an MP4 format and does not, well, it does require APA and MLA format. Let me back that up. It does require an APA or MLA formatted reference page, but nothing more is required. So you don't need to go in and ask, like, how do I put an image thing on there? None of that is relevant because this is the type of format this is should be a video, ultimately, when you're done, right? And the limits of creation are up to you, and you're not being graded on whether it looks good, meets agendas, or fits in any formal framework of thinking. Instead, I just want it to be something that you've created, that you feel comfortable creating, no matter how simple or complex, that does exactly what I've asked it to do. Tell me how you understand the word rhetoric, and if you understand it from multiple different perspectives, it's okay to do that. I'm not really worried about a length of time, but I wouldn't go for let's not go for James Cameron Avatar, so be safe there. Instead, I really want you to think about what rhetoric means to you and how you're impacted by your definition of the term. And that's it. It's super simple, but potentially dangerously complex. It has the potential to be overthought. If you find yourself overthinking, reach out to me. We can discuss it. We can find an avenue to help you get it completed in the time frame, because this has a pretty quick turnaround of about 7 days. But it could be something as simple as you talking into your phone with something in the background that you think is relevant, an artifact that fits the conversation for you of rhetoric. So that's the assignment. Now we get back into the reading. So the reading doesn't really require, you'll see that there's no discussion post, which usually there will be for the reading, not for this week's. Instead, what I'm trying to get you to do is I want you to do the reading, but I want you to think it through critically about how you write about what you're reading. And so you'll see that in the module notes, I have done so. So I've given you an example. So I said here, for example, for the reading, I would suggest taking notes and even asking questions through your understanding, lack of understanding, of the language, purpose, and rhetoric you see in this chapter, chapter 7 in Rhet Ops. We'll be switching back and forth between the books, so hopefully you have both of them by now. There is no real grade for this, so if you do not have them and you're still waiting, the grading portion will become next week when we start dealing with the discussion, the critical analysis paper that will come from it. But I've given you an example of how I would have produced notes, right? An example of what that might look like is provided below. And so I'm not going to read them to you. I think they're easily understood if you just read through them, how I wrote my notes for this, and you have a choice to do so or not. It may become problematic on those weeks where the assignment is a critical analysis paper and we're dealing with something like, I think next week's is semiotics. Let me look just so I'm on the same page. If you haven't looked at the calendar video that I provided, I've also provided this calendar in the files, but you'll see that next week we do a critical analysis of semiotics. And so we're talking about symbol systems, or the signs and what they do, and that will be reflected in that reading that we've done for this week. So you really get like 2 weeks to really sit down and marinate, if you will, in the reading and really think about it and chew it down to the bone before we deal with writing a paper on it. But for now, we're going to worry about the digital presentation. And I think that is pretty much a full week worth of work. My goal is to make enough work to stimulate thinking, to create a community that we can build on, but also give you a framework of understanding between what text is, as I've defined it in the module and during this lecture, And what you understand lecture is, if you understand that the only part that I'm coming from is the act or art of persuasion, or the use of the available means of persuasion, as Aristotle would say. So, if you have any questions, please reach out to me through the inbox. You have the coffee house is available. Again, as I reiterate, I think every time I mention the word coffee house, I follow it up with the 3 asterisks and say something like, remember that I don't get notification when you post to the coffee house, but I do get an inbox notification immediately. So if you're looking for a timely turnaround on a response to a question, the inbox will always be the most functional way to have a conversation with me about any questions you have on this week or previous week's modules. And with that, I hope you have a good week, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.